Hi, my name is Shelby Rest, and I'm taking Ed 304. This is my Coggle, and I entitled it The Brain because I feel like that's really the main thing that we studied this semester, the different aspects of the brain. So the three different categories that I chose were first the study of the brain, then we have the biology of the brain, and the processes of the brain. So I picked this because um, the study of the brain, it's important to know how we research and how we know all the things that we do about the brain. How do we know that those things are accurate or that we're studying them effectively? And then we have the biology of the brain. Basically, it just encompasses some of the main points that we hit during the semester and some of the main terms about what our brain is actually made up of, which I think is definitely relevant for studying the brain because different parts do different things and help us to um, live our lives and do many great things. And last, we have the processes of the brain, and basically that's just different things that the brain can actually do. So we have how we study the brain, the parts of the brain, and then what the brain does. So we'll start over here with the study of the brain. So we have research and learning theories. Research, we have meta-analysis, which is basically like delving into research that's already been done and analyzing that research. And then metacognition is kind of like thinking about thinking. So it's figuring out how we think by thinking about it. And then over here we have different types of research. Descriptive, which is when we're just observing something and our research is simply to describe it. And then we have correlational, which is figuring out whether two things are correlational or causational. And then we have experimental, which is when we're literally experimenting in order to research a question that we have. And then there's qualitative and quantitative. And qualitative has to do with the qualities of something, whereas quantitative is the quantity. And then down here we have the learning theories. So we have the five main ones: constructivism, behaviorism, relativism, cognitivism, and connectivism. And all these theories have been around for a while, but connectivism is one of the newest ones. So I think it's definitely relevant because we've entered this age of we're all coming together through technology and through different means. And so it's important to understand how that influences the way that people learn today. And then just a couple other theories that I thought were interesting is the dual coding, which is something we talked about a lot in class. There was talking about how when we learn something, it's important that it's through visual as well as learning the concept like we normally teach it. So if you're going to lecture, then give the students the content, but also imagery or something to connect together. And then there's social cognition. And then we'll skip over here to the biology of the brain. And so we have the different lobes, systems, the cerebrum, and the neuron. And so lobes, we have parietal, occipital, which has to do with sight and the eyes. Then we have temporal and frontal. And then over here we have the cerebrum, and then the corpus callosum, which is divided into hemispheres, basically right and left. And then lateralization up here is the idea that you're either left-brained or right-brained, and that those different parts of your brain do different things. Like one side is more mathematical and organized, while the other one is more creative. Whereas specialization is where it's not necessarily left and right, but just different parts of your brain do different things. And then we have the neuron, and let's see. So at one end we have, and this isn't set up quite correctly, but we have the dendrite is the beginning of the neuron, and it's basically like the antenna which receive information. And then we have the nucleus, which is like any other nucleus in a cell, and then the axon, which delivers the information to other parts of the body. And then we have the synapse, which is the part that connects with other neurons in order for the neurotransmitters to transmit to the other neuron. And then we have different systems, which are, these were just the main ones that we studied. Of course, there's more in the body. We have the limbic system, which is made up of the hypothalamus, the amygdala, thalamus, hippocampus, and many other things. And this one is basically responsible for regulating the body, like sleep and temperature and just different bodily functions. Then we have the central nervous system, which includes the brainstem, and then the endocrine system, which has to do with the releasing of hormones through the glands. And then we have another branch off of the biology of the brain, which is when we enter adolescence or we are emerging into adulthood. And this is called puberty. And so there's basically two different ways that it affects us, physically and mentally, or more specifically for this, psychosocial development. So physically we have the development of primary and secondary sexual characteristics. So primary are more like the breasts for women, or different things that directly affect the reproductive system. And then we have secondary, which is more like body hair, different things that don't necessarily affect it, but they do come at this time of puberty. And then we have sexuality, which with an increase of sexuality, more sexual activity, then there's more of a need for sexual education. And these kind of connect down here with the psychosocial development. So these are 5 things that kind of come up during puberty. There's identity, which is how adolescents see themselves, and autonomy is kind of like when they're becoming independent, they're becoming adults. And sexuality, like we talked about before, their bodies are changing and hormones are moving throughout their body, and they're gaining their primary and secondary sexual characteristics. And then we have down here intimacy, which is often mistaken for sexuality, that they're the same thing, but actually intimacy includes a lot of different things, emotional, mental, spiritual, physical. And then we have achievement, which is how students feel about their abilities and what they're able to achieve. So last we have the processes of the brain, and I split it up into acquiring new knowledge, memory, intelligence, and the cognitive belief system. But really you could organize this in several different ways. So as far as learning new knowledge, up here at the top we have assimilation and accommodation. And assimilation is when you take new information that you've learned and you can enter it into your brain, kind of just making room for it, but it fits with the old information that you already have in your brain. And then accommodation is when the new information doesn't quite agree with the old, and so you have to make some kind of accommodation. And then we have Bloom's taxonomy, and there's 3 different domains. There's the psychomotor domain, affective domain, and the cognitive domain. So these are kind of like the different levels of the way that we learn things in these different domains. So cognitively, just for an example, we receive knowledge, and then we begin to comprehend that knowledge, which is the second level. And then we apply it, stage 3. Stage 4 is analysis, 5 synthesis, and 6 evaluation. So it's kind of the same idea with the other domains as well, where you receive information and you analyze it and everything, and it becomes who you actually are, how you act, and what you do. So let's see, if we move down here to memory, we have different types of memory, explicit and implicit. And then we have time frames, which we have long-term memory, which is when we can remember things for a long period of time. Or we have short-term or working memory, which is kind of like a clipboard, where we just have the immediate things that are important right now that we need to remember, like what our boss wanted on our sandwich at Subway, or whatever it might be. It's something that we don't necessarily need to remember for the rest of our lives. So for the long term, there's also something called procedural memory, where we remember how to do different things. It's kind of like muscle memory. We've done a certain procedure or process several times, so we know how to do it. It goes into our long-term memory. And then there's the transfer of learning, where we learn one thing, and the principles and the concepts can transfer over to another idea or another thing that we do. And then intuition is a little bit of the same thing as transfer of learning. It's where we have learned many things before that help us to deduce what we should do in a situation that might use those same kinds of skills and concepts. So then if we move down to intelligence, there's crystallized intelligence and fluid intelligence. And crystallized is more like it's cemented into our brain. It's something that won't necessarily budge. It's been there for a long time. We've made different pathways to it. Whereas fluid is more fluid. And so then we have the deductive reasoning and inductive. Deductive is where you look at the big picture and you can deduce many little things from that picture. Whereas inductive is where there's lots of little things and you put them together to understand the big picture. And then for our last tree we have the cognitive belief system. And so I copied over some of the things that we studied for psychosocial development. So we have identity, autonomy, sexuality, intimacy, achievement. For identity, we have self-esteem, how someone sees themselves, or how they feel about themselves, and then self-concept is how they see themselves. And a lot of times, body dissatisfaction can come from that. Also, eating disorders like bulimia or anorexia, or overeating. And then there's autonomy, and oftentimes people will take on risk-taking at a younger age because they want to feel like they're independent, so they take a lot of risks. And then we have dating, coming from intimacy. Then over here we have achievement, and we talked about how anxiety has a lot to do with that, and whether or not anxiety is a good thing, or if it's bad for students. And so we have facilitating, which means that it's a good level of anxiety that gets a student going or gets them to work harder or be successful, whereas debilitating just gets them down and doesn't help them to accomplish what they need to. And then we have two types of anxiety. We have trait and state. And state is more of like a permanent thing where it's just part of you and you become anxious about tons of different things. And then trait is more like there's just a few different things that make you anxious, but it isn't necessarily like your personality. So, with that said, I have really learned a lot during this course, and I think that at first I didn't understand the importance of studying the brain when we're learning about how to teach people, but this semester I've learned that it's important to understand these things because then you can understand how a student acts, why they act the way that they do, and how their belief systems and their memory, their intelligence, how puberty is affecting them. I think that was one of the biggest things for me, is just all the many ways that as our body is developing, how that influences how a student's going to learn. Like anxiety may play a big part. If their body's changing and they don't know why, they might become anxious or not understand it exactly. Or risk-taking, a student might be going through these changes and not know how to feel about themselves, their self-esteem, their self-concept, and so they might take more risks. And we need to, as educators, we need to be thoughtful and mindful of the different things that students might be going through and how their brains are developing. And so I think it's important to study up on the different research that comes out, the new research and the old that we have available to us.